So now today, we will demonstrate on how to use the dependency injection in services in Angular. First of all, we have, in order to demonstrate this concept, we have to create a service file. So in order to create that, we will type in ng generate component service or letter S, then the name of your service. For my case, the name of my service is data, and it will basically create a new file called data.service.ts, wherein some repeated or some methods that you're gonna use in multiple components are gonna be stored here, and which is the best way to create a method here in Angular if it's going to be used by plenty of components. Then afterwards, we will create our component that will use the service. In order to do that, ng generate component. Let's say it's a home component. Then while waiting for it, um, we will first edit the home component HTML before creating a method inside the service component. But first of all, we will input the app home here in our app component.html. Now in our home component.html, we will just basically put a p tag wherein we will um, interpolate the variable my data and parse it into a JSON format. Because in this demonstration, I will show you how to um, use an API call in order to get some data inside a fake API in the website or online. And inside our home component, we will create a variable called myData with the type of any. Then afterwards, we will create a constructor to inject our service, wherein it's going to be private my data service, and its type is data service. Then it is going to be automatically imported. Then in our data.service.ts, in our constructor, we have to inject the HTTP module in order to do an API calls like get, post, and delete, and update, and etc. So in here, uh, we will first inject the HTTP client module. So how to do that? We will create a private variable HTTP with a type of HTTP client. And then in our app module.ts, you always have to make sure that in your app module.ts, the HTTP client module exists in the imports, and the HTTP client also exists in the imports array. And afterwards, in our data.service.ts, we will create a method that allows us to get data from an API online. This is only a fake API, so this is not really a usable API if it's for production level. But if you want to practice on it, you can only use the get method in here. So what should we do is we type in this dot http dot get, then https slash slash rest countries dot com slash v2 slash all question mark fields is equals to name comma region comma area, and then we will do that. Then I did it first, I didn't create the method, so we will create a method called get data. Then inside that, we will paste the code that we typed in earlier. Now for the concept of dependency injection, Dependency injection helps us to use some certain libraries in order that to make our life easier, maybe to use some libraries in their specific way. Like for example, this HTTP client library or import in Angular. This allows us to use the get, the post, the update, and the delete methods for the HTTP client and etc. But for now, in this example, we will only use um, the get method. Then we will save that. Then, like the concept of injecting HTTP client inside our data.service, what we will do next is in our home.component.ts, we will inject this this class in our home component.ts. Why? Because our home component.ts is also going to use that data service, wherein in our constructor, we always create a private variable with a type of the class that we used. So basically, we basically earlier we created a variable my data service with a type of data service wherein this is our custom class that we created earlier using the Angular command ng generate s then the data. So again, here in our home component.ts, the process of using the data service is these component or this variable inside our constructor allows us to access the methods inside our data.service.ts, wherein the get data method is also usable in our home.component.ts. Um, in that case, I will create a ng on init void. Then I will create a method here. Oh, first of all, the ng on init allows Angular to execute some line of codes or some syntaxes that will automatically execute or trigger when we run the server. I will show it to you later. And now we will create a method called get data. Then in here, we will type this dot my data service, wherein as you can see, this is the variable that we created inside our constructor with the data service type that we created earlier using the Angular command. So this dot my data service dot get data dot subscribe data any, and we will put a code here that means this dot my data is equal to the data. Okay. Then this means that while we are getting the method from our data service or our data service file in our Angular, we'll also execute the method. And this method, the get data method, I will put a get data home so that it won't be confusing. So this dot my data service, basically this method tells the system that I will execute a method inside my data service file, wherein the method is get data, and then I will subscribe to it and get the data that we fetch from the API, and then store that data in the variable data, wherein it's inside this subscribe or inside this parentheses with a type of any. And then afterwards, I will um I will store that data in my data that I created here in the home component. Again, it's a bit confusing. Um, Basically, this method will allow the system or the home component to access a method inside our my data service, wherein this is the my data service, and then it will execute the method inside our my data service, wherein the name of the method is get data. And then this method, the get data home will subscribe to the method getData in the service file and store the JSON data or the data that was collected by doing the API call get. And afterwards, after getting that data and storing it into the variable data, our method will store the data variable or the JSON data that we get from our API into the variable that we created, my data. Then afterwards, this is going to be used by our HTML file wherein it will show us the data that we got from the API call in a JSON format. So um, as a demonstration, I will run my server ngserve. Then while waiting for it, the server is running. And then by clicking this localhost 4200, we'll basically see that, oh wait, I didn't save this. I think there's something wrong in our code. Um, Let me double check on it again. Oh yeah, we didn't put the method in our ng on it, so that's why it's not running because we don't have a button or something to trigger this method. So in this ng on init, this dot get data home, then when we save it, it's basically gonna show us the JSON data that we collected from our API call in this data.service, wherein the API has this JSON contents like the name, the region, and the area, and if it's independent or not. This is basically an array of data in a website or in a API, stored in an API that can be used for practice, or maybe sometimes you can customly create a API and then use it for your own personal use. And I will explain it to you how this method works. So basically, if we trigger this get data in our home component.ts, wherein we executed it in here, we triggered this by accessing the data service that we created. Then we called its method get data. So in here, the get data is here. Then the process of the get data is it will return the contents of this link, wherein it's going to be the countries, the region, and the area, and if it's independent or not. Basically, this is a free API that you can also use if you want to. Then we can only apply the get method here because there's some um, specific parameters that we should do in order to do a post method. But it also depends on the API if it allows a post method. So again, I will explain again the dependency injection, how it occurred, and how the service is working. First of all, in our data.service, we injected the HTTP client. Okay? Basically, after injecting the HTTP client, we also need to import it in our service file. But afterwards, or after doing it, you should also double check if you have the HTTP client import in your app module.ts and make sure that in your imports array, the HTTP client module is also existing. And going back to our data.service.ts, after injecting the HTTP client, wherein you can create a private variable and make its type to be the HTTP client. It's not an HTTP client module type because that's the general library for the HTTP client, but we only need the specific one wherein it is not the HTTP client module, it's only the HTTP client. And afterwards, after injecting it, we can access the methods inside the HTTP client wherein it can be get, and etc., pose, and etc. And after creating this method, it just basically tells us that this method will return the data that was collected after executing the get method in this API. Then afterwards, after creating the data, we have to make a component that will use the method inside our data.service.ts, wherein in my case, it's the home component.ts. And inside our home component.ts, we injected the private my data service. Basically, we injected the data service that we created. As you can see on my cursor, this is the data service that we created, that we also injected inside our home component.ts to execute or to use the methods inside it. Um, Basically, after injecting it, we will create a method getDataHome, wherein this getDataHome will access the method inside the myData service, wherein the method is getData, and subscribe to it, wherein as you can see, this is an observable, but we will talk about that in our future courses, wherein after subscribing to the method getData, the subscribe method will store the data that was collected into this variable data with a type of any, and afterwards, after collecting it, we will store the data that was collected to our variable my data so that we can access it and use it in our HTML. Then afterwards, in our ngOn init, wherein the purpose of ngOn init is to automatically execute the method if the server is running. After putting the ngOn init, after putting the method inside the ngOn init, our HTML file will automatically detect the myData variable because it is interpolated and it is parsed into a JSON format. If we remove this JSON format, then save it, it's just gonna show us object, object, and objects because our the HTML file can't decide or can't detect what type of data is being collected or is being shown, wherein it doesn't have the capability to automatically detect it. That's why we have to parse it into a JSON format. As you can see, the data are showing in our HTML file, and that's basically how you use the data service and how to inject it in a component and how can we use the get API call in a API website. That's all for this demo. In our next lecture, I will show you more on how to use the data service or the service and how to use the dependency injection here in Angular. Thank you.